Much of the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible's focus on God's promises for his people, which primarily involved a promise of rest, lie in the physical land of Canaan. His promised blessings, if they're obedient, are mostly earthly in nature, such as peace from their enemies, good crops, and fertility of their livestock and their women. Even God's covenants, as we've seen in previous lessons, are phrased in earthly terms, with promises like a son of David would rule on the throne in Jerusalem to usher in a kingdom of God. But in the actual sacred narrative of Israel, those promises seem to keep getting further away, especially after the Davidic dynasty ended when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. So we see a tendency in the prophets after this pivotal event to focus on the either spiritual and or future prophecy. Such new foci among the latter prophets could take many forms, such as a focus on the cleansing of the sins of the people rather than merely avoidance of the loss of earthly blessings, as we saw with Ezekiel, or an appeal for social justice and Torah study, rather than observances of ritual temple laws, which could not be practiced during certain periods of their history. But the major covenants with Abraham, Moses, and David, which were arguably the framework for the entire worldview of Israel, had to be understood somehow. So in the post-exilic period, we see a rise and an explanation of how these grand prophecies would be fulfilled. And one of the most predominant ways the latter prophets did so was by taking an apocalyptic stance, which had both spiritualized and futuristic views of prophecy. For my lesson on this, see the link in the description below. One of the problems one encounters when trying to nail down the nature of apocalyptic literature is the tremendous variety of how it manifests. Scholars have difficulty even defining terms like apocalypse, apocalypticism, and apocalyptic. I won't wade off into the vast arguments for how these terms should be defined, but merely give an oversimplified explanation in the interest of brevity here. Apocalypse comes from a Greek word meaning a revealing. In the context of the prophetic literature of the Bible, it is an attempt to understand how God's grand promises will be fulfilled. As we've seen, those promises could only be seen as being fulfilled in the future or spiritually or both. Apocalyptic books of the Bible do accomplish this and on a much grander scale than the earlier non-apocalyptic prophets. Apocalyptic writings tend to have certain traits, but do not always have all of the ones I'm going to list. But these should help the reader begin to differentiate this trend that began to emerge in the post-exilic period. Almost always, apocalyptic literature is pseudonymous, with the prophet being presented as a great man from antiquity, such as Adam, Enoch, or Abraham. Revelation is sort of, or possibly, the only major exception to this, which I explain in my book. Most apocalyptic books include incredible visions, such as those found in Daniel, which focus on a supernatural world. The one receiving the vision often is transported to heavenly realms, where secret knowledge is revealed by angels. Paul himself mentions such a vision that some guy had in 2 Corinthians 12. Information revealed can be about the fate of the dead, but also what the future holds. Typically, the end time is imminent, the time when all things will be restored, as they were at the beginning of creation, especially when man was close to God in the Eden. The wicked will finally be punished, and the righteous will finally have their reward. Some apocalyptic literature looks forward to simply God establishing his throne in Jerusalem with the descendant of David. Some look forward to an utterly transformed new heavens and new earth, as in Isaiah 65 and 66. Not all apocalyptic writings have all of these criteria. Some apocalyptic elements are found in books like Joel and Zechariah. Passages in Isaiah, such as chapters 24 to 27 and 33, are quite well-developed apocalypses. The last half of Daniel, chapter 7 and onward, is seen by scholars as one of the most quintessentially apocalyptic works. To further understand the importance of apocalyptic prophecy, we should mention a few more things that the New Testament writers believed about the coming of the kingdom that are almost always overlooked by moderns. They believed in celestial armies and angels which would restore God's reign on earth at the end of the age. Men would not have to. That's why Jesus told his followers that the couple of swords they had was enough in Luke 22. And he never told his followers that they would have to fight physical battles. They also believe that the angelic armies fought battles that could not be seen, but which were mirrored in the earthly battles that the earthly nations fought. This concept is especially visible in Daniel, where, to cite one example, an angel is delayed 21 days from coming to Daniel because he was apparently fighting against the, quote, prince of the Persian kingdom, end quote, until the archangel Michael reinforced him in the battle. The prince of Persia could very well have been the divine counterpart to the actual earthly king. In other words, the ancients may very well have viewed this as heavenly war between good angels and what we would call demons. The authorities in the heavens, with their corresponding authorities on the earth, are to be thrown into the pit, for the heavens languish together with the earth. This connection that causes the earthly to mirror the heavenly realm is often expressed today with the expression, as above, so below, or the principle of correspondence. It is not just limited to astrology, which also appears in the Bible, as I note in another lesson regarding the sorcerers who follow a star to baby Jesus with gifts in Luke. And I think it very likely that the, quote, time of the Gentiles, end quote, when the temple and the nation of Israel were being judged, was seen as having a heavenly parallel. We'll come back to this topic in later lessons, where we'll see that the apocalyptic-minded Jews of the first century had a fairly developed angelology and demonology. These concepts, although most people probably don't think that they already know them, are actually ingrained in our culture, apparently, because they appear in many popular artistic works, even ones written by atheists. They include the songs called As Above, So Below, one performed by Cryoshell and another by In This Moment, both of which speak of a final judgment. One of my personal favorites is a Bob Dylan song, which says, "For the tree of life is growing where the spirit never dies, and the bright light of salvation up in dark and empty skies. When the cities are on fire with the burning flesh of men, just remember that death is not the end." Note the parallel between the light and dark above and the fires and darkness below. And of course, apocalypticism still appears in modern movies, but also even in science itself, for even modern scientists contemplate how the cosmos will end, whether it's our world being wiped out by an asteroid or the whole universe quietly getting colder, sort of like T.S. Eliot phrases it in The Hollow Man, or William Yeats in The Second Coming. Anyway, back to the earliest apocalypticists. As we've noted, early prophetic content of the Hebrew Bible saw Yahweh's blessings or curses as earthly in nature, and predicated on the obedience of both his people Israel and even the nations, at least in some passages. There is virtually a total absence of mentions of the afterlife, and certainly no need to explain that there will be ultimate justice in the next world, as that justice is usually seen as carried out on earth itself. The latter prophets would be a major shift away from this focus. By the time of the New Testament, apocalyptic fervor had reached its height, as we've already noted in previous lessons. Although the year count had somewhat overshot Daniel's sevenfold adaptation of Jeremiah's 70 years, that did not stop it from being a period of a flourishing number of messiahs and of insurrection against the Roman quote-unquote world empire, in anticipation of the advent of a son of David who would establish a new world order when God would finally get hold of his rule on earth. This issue was compounded by the fact that Daniel explicitly stated that the Messiah's rule would arise during a fourth empire, which many then and now conclude to be Rome. Although the book of Revelation is one of the most apocalyptic books of the New Testament, borrowing heavily from such works as Ezekiel and Daniel, there is much else in the New Testament which is apocalyptic. I've noted in previous lessons language regarding Jesus' second coming to, quote, restore all things, end quote. But Jesus himself actually taught a message that was essentially apocalyptic. Near the end of each of the three synoptic gospels, Jesus leaves behind some of the most important messages in a sermon before his ascension, and it is such an apocalyptic message that it is actually called Jesus' little apocalypse. I'll come back to the radical message of the New Testament in a later series, but for now I want to focus on another fascinating message woven throughout the whole Hebrew Bible, and that is when God broke his own law in the next lesson.